Mortality by Christopher Hitchens. Forward by Graydon Carter. At a dinner in Los Angeles this spring, a young actor named Emil Hirsch came up to me in a state of high excitement. He knew I had worked with Christopher Hitchens for many years, and he just wanted to talk about Christopher with someone who knew him. He'd read Hitch 22 and was well into the Kissinger book, and he said that Christopher's writing had affected him in a way that almost no one else had. In the months following Christopher's death, I had similar encounters with young people who felt compelled to talk about how his writing had touched them. It's no exaggeration to say that Christopher had few equals in the sphere of spirited commentary, but there was something in his saucy fearlessness, in his great turbine of a mind, and in his sociable but unpredictable brand of anarchy that seriously touched kids in their 20s and early 30s in much the same way that Hunter S. Thompson had a generation before. Young Emil asked if there was going to be a memorial service, and I told him that there would be one in New York and that we were bookmarking April 20th as a tentative date. The memorial was indeed held on the 20th in the Great Hall at Cooper Union in Greenwich Village. My Vanity Fair colleagues Amy Bell, Christopher's longtime editor at the magazine, and Sarah Marks organized the readings, all of them from Christopher's own work. We wanted to produce a program that would be cozy and loving, but in no way sentimental or mawkish. And the great and the good of English letters turned up to pay tribute and to console his widow, Carol, and his three children, Martin Amis, Tom Stoppard, Salman Rushdie, Ian McEwan, and James Fenton were there, and they all spoke. Editors such as Anna Wintour, David Remick, Jim Kelly, and Rick Stengel came. So did Christopher's brother Peter, Andrew Sullivan, Christopher Buckley, Andrew and Leslie Cockburn, and their daughter, the fine actress Olivia Wilde, and Andrew's brother Patrick. The Bush administration was represented by former Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz, a remnant of the curious right turn Christopher took in the lead up to the Iraq War. Hollywood was represented by Sean Penn and, as I was pleased to see, by young Mr. Hirsch. After the memorial, the participants retired to the Waverly Inn nearby and drank and smoked in the sunshine and reminisced about Christopher. Although the day was bathed in sorrow, there was a magical quality to the afternoon as it spilled into the evening and through the midnight, when there were still a dozen or more mourners. For those who were there, Christopher's memorial was, as we used to say in the 1960s, a happening, and a day we will not soon forget. For the fact is that Christopher was one of life's singular characters, a wit, a charmer, a troublemaker, and a dear and devoted friend. He was a man of insatiable appetites for cigarettes, for scotch, for company, for great writing, and above all, for conversation. That he had an output to equal what he took in was the miracle in the man. You'd be hard pressed to find a writer who could match the outpouring of exquisitively crafted columns, essays, articles, and books he produced over the past 4 decades. He wrote often, constantly, in fact, and right up to the end. And Christopher wrote fast, frequently without the benefit of a second draft or even corrections. Perhaps in the back of his mind, he knew that his time on the stage would end in the second act, and he was racing to get it all in and to get it all out. I can recall a lunch in 1991 when I was editing the New York Observer, and he and Annie and Amy and I got together for a quick bite at a restaurant on Madison, no longer there. Christopher's copy was due early that afternoon. Pre-lunch tumblers of scotch were followed by a couple of glasses of wine during the meal and then a couple of post-meal cognacs. That was his intake. After stumbling back to the office, we set him up at a rickety table and an old Olivetti. And in a symphony of clacking, he produced a 1,000-word column of near perfection in under half an hour. Christopher was one of the first writers I called when I came to Vanity Fair in 1992, 6 years before I had asked him to write for Spy. That offer was politely rejected. The Vanity Fair approach had a fee attached, though, and to my everlasting credit, he accepted and was the signature columnist for the magazine from there on. With the exception of Dominic Dunn, who died in 2009, no writer has been more associated with Vanity Fair. There was no subject too big or too small for Christopher. Over the past 2 decades, he traveled to just about every hot spot you can think of. He also subjected himself to any manner of humiliation or discomfort in the name of his column. I once sent him out on a mission to break the most niggling laws still on the books in New York City, one of which forbade riding a bicycle with your feet off the pedals. The photograph that ran with the column of Christopher sailing a small bike through Central Park with his legs in the air looked like something out of the Moscow circus. At the suggestion of Tom Headley, an old hand from Harold Hayes, Esquire, I set him off on a course of self improvement for a 3-part series in which he would subject himself to a myriad of treatments to refurbish his dental area and other dark regions. At one point, I suggested he go to a well regarded waxing parlor in town for what they indelicately call the sack, back, and crack. He struggled to absorb the full meaning of this, but after a few seconds, he smiled a nervous smile and said, "In for a penny." Christopher was the beau ideal for the public intellectual. You felt as though he was writing to you and to you alone. And as a result, many readers felt they knew him. Walking with him down the street in New York or through an airplane terminal was like escorting a movie star through the throngs. Christopher was not just brave in facing the illness that took him, but brave in words and thought. He did not mind landing outside the cozy cocoon of conventional liberal wisdom. His pro-war stance before the invasion of Iraq being but one example. Friends distanced themselves from him during those unlit days, but he stuck to his guns. After his rather famous 1995 attack on Mother Teresa, one of our contributing editors, a devout Catholic, came into the office filled with umbrage and announced that he was canceling his subscription. "You can't cancel it," I said. "You get the magazine for free." Years ago, in the midst of the Clinton impeachment uproar, Christopher had a very public dust-up with his friend Sidney Blumenthal, a Clinton White House functionary. The dispute was over which part of a conversation between them was or was not on the record. Christopher wound up on television a lot defending himself. He looked like hell, and I suggested we bring him to New York for a bit of a makeover and some R&R away from the cameras. The magazine was pretty flush back then, and we set him up with a new suit, shirt, ties, and such. When someone from the fashion department asked him what size his shoes were, he said he didn't know. The pair he had on was borrowed. I cannot begin to list the pantheon of public intellectuals and close friends who will mourn his passing, and it is not limited to those who made it to his memorial. Christopher had his share of lady admirers too, including, but certainly not limited to, Miss Wintour, back when he was young and still relatively fragrant. His wife Carol, a writer, filmmaker, and legendary hostess, set a high bar in how to handle a flower like Christopher, both when he was healthy and during his more weekend days. An invitation to their vast apartment in the Wyoming on Columbia Road in Washington, D.C., was a prize reward for being a part of their circle or even on the fringes of it. We used to hold an anti-White House correspondence dinner party there in the 1990s and 2000s. The Salon des Refusés, he called it. You could meet anyone there, from Supreme Court justices to right-wing windbags, too. Well, Barbara Streisand and other assorted totems of the left. He was a good friend of who wished his friends well, and as a result, he had a lot of them. Christopher had an enviable career arc that began with his own brand of fiery journalism at Britain's New Statesman and then wended its way to America, where he wrote for everyone from The Atlantic and Harper's to Slate and the New York Times Book Review. And we all called him our own. He was legend on the speaker's circuit and could debate just about anyone on anything. He won umpteen awards, although that was not the sort of thing that fueled his work. And in the last decade, he wrote bestsellers, including his well-received best-selling memoir, Hitch 22, that finally put some money in his family's pocket. In the last weeks of his life, he was told that an asteroid had been named after him. He was pleased by the thought, and inasmuch as the word is derived from the Greek meaning star-like, and asteroids are known to be volatile, it is a fitting honor. To his friends, Christopher will be remembered for his elevated but inclusive humor and for a staggering, almost punishing memory that held up under the most liquid of late night conditions. And to all of us, his readers, Christopher Hitchens will be remembered for the words he left behind. These last ones, free as they are of sentiment or self pity, are among his last. They are also among his best. June 2012, New York City. Chapter 1. I have more than once in my time woken up feeling like Darth, like death. But nothing prepared me for the early morning in June when I came to consciousness feeling as if I were actually shackled to my own corpse. The whole cave of my chest and thorax seemed to have been hollowed out and then refilled with slow drying cement. I could faintly hear myself breathe, but could not manage to inflate my lungs. My heart was beating either too much or too little. Any movement, however slight, required forethought and planning. It took strenuous effort for me to cross the room of my New York hotel and summon the emergency services. They arrived with great dispatch and behaved with immense courtesy and professionalism. I had the time to wonder why they needed so many boots and helmets and so much heavy backup equipment, but now that I view the scene in retrospect, I see it as a very gentle and firm deportation, taking me from the country of the well across the stark frontier that marks off the land of the malady. Within a few hours, having had to do quite a lot of emergency work on my heart and my lungs, the physician at this sad border post had shown me a few other postcards from the interior and told me that my immediate next stop would have been with an oncologist. Some kind of shadow was throwing itself across the negatives. The previous evening, I had been launching my latest book at a successful event in New Haven. The night of the terrible morning, I was supposed to go on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart and then appear at a sold-out event at the 92nd Street Y on the Upper East Side in conversation with Salman Rushdie. My very short-lived campaign of denial took this form. I would not cancel these appearances or let down my friends or miss the chance of selling a stack of my books. I managed to pull off both gigs without one noticing anything amiss, though I did vomit 2 times with an extraordinary combination of accuracy, neatness, violence, and profusion just before each show. This is what citizens of the sick country do while they are still hopelessly clinging to their old domicile. The new land is quite welcoming in its way. Everybody smiles encouragingly, and there appears to be absolutely no racism. A generally egalitarian spirit prevails, and those who run the place have obviously got where they are on merit and hard work. As against that, the humor is a touch feeble and repetitive. There seems to be almost no talk of sex, and the cuisine is the worst of any destination I have ever visited. The country has a language of its own, a lingua franca that manages to be both dull and difficult, and that contains names like ondansetron or anti-nausea medication, as well as some unsettling gestures that require a bit of getting used to. For example, an official met for the first time may abruptly sink his fingers into your neck. That's how I discovered that my cancer had spread to my lymph nodes, and that one of these deformed beauties, located on my right clavicle or collarbone, was big enough to be seen and felt. It's not all that good when your cancer is palpable from the outside, especially when, as at this stage, they didn't even know where the primary source was. Carcinoma works cunningly from the inside out. Detection and treatment often work more slowly and gropingly from the outside in. Many needles were sunk into my clavicle area. Tissue is the issue, being a hot slogan in the local Tumorville tongue, and I was told the biopsy results might take a week. Working back from the cancer-ridden squamous cells that these first results disclosed, it took rather longer that to discover the disagreeable truth. The word metastasize was the one in the report that first caught my eye and ear. The alien had colonized a bit of my lung as well as quite a bit of my lymph node, and its original base of operations had been located for quite some time in my esophagus. My father had died, and very swiftly, too, of cancer of the esophagus. He was 79. I am 61. In whatever kind of a race life may be, I have very abruptly became a finalist. The notorious stage theory of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, whereby one progresses from denial to rage through bargaining to depression and the eventual bliss of acceptance, hasn't so far had much application to my case. In one way, I suppose I have been in denial for some time, knowingly burning the candle at both ends and finding that it often gives a lovely light. But for precisely that reason, I can't see myself smitting my brow with shock or hear myself whining about how it's all so unfair. I've been taunting the Reaper into taking a free scythe in my direction and have now succumbed to something so predictable and banal that it bores even me. Rage would be beside the point for some reason. Instead, I am badly oppressed by the gnawing sense of waste. I had real plans for my next decade, and felt I'd worked hard enough to earn it. Will I really not live to see my children married? To watch the World Trade Center rise again? To read, if not indeed to write, the obituaries of elderly villains like Henry Kissinger and Joseph Ratzinger? But I understand this sort of non-thinking for what it is, sentimentality and self-pity. Of course, my book hit the bestsellers list on the day that I received the grimmest of news bulletins. And for that matter, the last flight I took as a healthy feeling person to a fine, big audience at the Chicago Book Fair was one that made me a million miler on United Airlines with a lifetime of free upgrades to look forward to. But irony is my business, and I just can't see any ironies here. Would it be less poignant to get cancer on the day that my memoirs were remained? Would it be less poignant to get cancer on the day that my memoirs were remaindered as a box office turkey, or that I bounced from a coach class flight and left on the tarmac? To the dumb question, why me? The cosmos barely bothers to return the reply. Why not? The bargaining stage, though, maybe there's a loophole here. The oncology bargain is that, in return for at least the chance of a few more useful years, you agree to submit to chemotherapy, and then, if you are lucky with that, the radiation or even surgery. So here's the wager. You stick around for a bit, but in return, we are going to need some things from you. These things may include your taste buds, your ability to concentrate, your ability to digest, and the hair on your head. This certainly appears to be a reasonable trade. Unfortunately, it also involves confronting one of the most appealing cliches in our language. You've heard that right. People don't have cancer. They are reported to be battling cancer. No well-wisher omits the combative image. You can beat this, it's even in obituaries for cancer losers, as if one might reasonably say of someone that they died after a long and brave struggle with mortality. You don't hear it about long-term sufferers from heart disease or kidney failure. Myself, I love the imagery of struggle. I sometimes wish I were suffering in a good cause or risking my life for good of others instead of just being a gravely endangered patient. Allow me to inform you, though, that when you sit in a room with a set of other finalists and kindly people bring a huge transparent bag of poison and plug it into your arm, and you either read it or don't read a book while the venom sac gradually empties itself into your system, the image of the ardent soldier or revolutionary is the very last one that will occur to you. You feel swamped with passivity and impotence, dissolving in powerlessness like a sugar lump in water. It's quite something, this chemo poison. It has caused me to lose about 14 pounds, though without making me feel any lighter. It has cleared up a vicious rash on my shins that no doctor could ever name, let alone cure. Some venom to get rid of those furious red dots without a struggle. Let it please be this mean and ruthless with the alien and its spreading dead zone colonies. But as against that, the death dealing stuff and life preserving stuff have also made me strangely neuter. I was fairly reconciled to the loss of my hair, which began to come out in the shower and in the first 2 weeks of treatment, in which I saved a plastic bag so that I could fill it up with a floating dam in the Gulf of Mexico. But I wasn't quite prepared for the way that my razor blade would suddenly go slipping pointlessly down my face, meeting no stubble, or for the way that my newly smoothed upper lip would begin to look as if it had undergone electrolysis, causing me to look a bit too much like somebody's maiden auntie. The chest hair that was once the toast of two continents hasn't yet wilted, but so much of it was shaved off for various hospital incisions that it's a rather patchy affair. I feel upsettingly denatured. If Penelope Cruz were one of my nurses, I wouldn't even notice. In the war against Thanatos, if we must term it a war, the immediate loss of Eros is a huge initial sacrifice. These are my first raw reactions to being stricken. I am quite quietly resolved to resist bodily as best as I can, even if only passively, and to seek the most advanced advice. My heart and blood pressure and many other registers are now strong again. Indeed, it occurs to me that if I didn't have such a stout constitution, I might have led a much healthier life thus far. Against me is the blind, emotionless alien, cheered on by some who have long wished me ill. But on the side of my continued life is a group of brilliant and selfless physicians, plus an astonishing number of prayer groups. On both of these, I hope to write next time if, as my father invariably said, I am spared. Chapter 2. When I described the tumor in my esophagus as a blind, emotionless alien, I suppose that I even couldn't help awarding it to some of the qualities of a living thing. This, at least, I know to be a mistake, an instance of the pathetic fallacy, angry cloud, proud mountain, presumptuous little Bejualis, by which we ascribe animate qualities to inanimate phenomena. To exist, a cancer needs a living organism, but it cannot ever become a living organism. Its whole malice, there I go again, lies in the fact that the best it can do is to die with its host. Either that or its host will find the measures with which to extirpate and outlive it. But as I knew before I became ill, there are some people for whom this explanation is unsatisfying. To them, a rodent carcinoma really is dedicated. Conscious agent, a slow acting suicide murderer on a consecrated mission from heaven. You haven't lived, if I can put it like this, until you have read contributions such as this on the websites of the faithful. Who else feels Christopher Hitchens getting terminal throat cancer was God's revenge for him using his voice to blaspheme him? Atheists like to ignore facts. They like to act like everything is a coincidence. Really, It's just a coincidence that our out of any part of his body, Christopher Hitchens got cancer in the one part of his body he used for blasphemy? Yeah, keep believing that, atheists. He's going to writhe in agony and pain and wither away into nothing and then die a horrible, agonizing death. And then comes the real fun when he's sent to hellfire forever to be tortured and set afire. Wow. There are numerous passages in Holy Scripture and religious tradition that for centuries made this kind of gloating into a mainstream belief. Long before it concerned me particularly, I had understood the obvious objections. First, which mere primate is so damn sure that he can know the mind of God? Second, would this anonymous author want his views to be read by my unoffending children, who are also being given a hard time in their way and by the same God? Side note, God is lowercase. Third, why not a thunderbolt for yours truly, or something similarly awe-inspiring? The vengeful deity has a sadly depleted arsenal if all he can think of is exactly the cancer that my age and former lifestyle would suggest that I got. Fourth, why cancer at all? Almost all men get cancer of the prostate if they live long enough. It's an undignified thing, but quite evenly distributed among saints and sinners, believers and unbelievers. If you maintain that God awards the appropriate cancers, you must also account for the numbers of infants who contract leukemia. Devout persons have died young and in pain. But Bertrand Russell and Voltaire, Voltaire, by contrast, remained spry until the end, as many psychopathic criminals and tyrants have also done. These visitations then seem awfully random. My so far uncancerous throat, let me rush to assure my Christian correspondents above, is not at all the only organ with which I have blasphemed. And even if my voice goes before I do, I shall continue to write polemics against religious delusions, at least until it's hello darkness, my old friend. In which case, why not cancer of the brain? As a terrified, half-aware imbecile, I might even scream for a priest at the close of business, though I hereby state, while I am still lucid, that the entity thus humiliating itself would not be, in fact, me. Bear this in mind in case of any later rumors or fabrications. The absorbing fact about being mortally sick is that you spend a good deal of time preparing yourself to die with some modicum of stoicism and provision for loved ones, while being simultaneously and highly interested in the business of survival. This is a distinctively bizarre way of living. Lawyers in the morning and doctors in the afternoon, and means that one has to exist even more than usual in a double frame mind. The same is true, it seems, of those who pray for me. And most of these are just as religious as the chap who wants me to be tortured in the here and now, which I will be even if I eventually recover, and then tortured forever into the bargain if I don't recover, or presumably and ultimately even if I do. Of the astonishing and flattering number of people who wrote to me when I fell ill, very few failed to say one of two things. Either they assured me that they wouldn't offend me by offering prayers, or they tenderly insisted that they would pray anyway. Devotional websites consecrated special space to the question. If you should read this in time, by all means, keep in mind that September 20th, 2010 has already been designated Everybody Pray for Hitchens Day. Pat Archbold at the National Catholic Register and Deacon Greg Kandra were among the Roman Catholics who thought me a worthy object of prayer. Rabbi David Wolpe, author of Why Faith Matters and the leader of the major congregation in Los Angeles, said the same. He has been a debating partner of mine, as have several Protestant evangelical conservatives like Pastor Douglas Wilson of the New St. Andrews College and Larry Taunton of the Fixed Point Foundation in Birmingham, Alabama. Both wrote to say that their assemblies were praying for me, and it was to them that it first occurred to me to write back, asking, praying for what? As with many of the Catholics who essentially pray for me to see the light as much as to get better, they were very honest. Salvation was the main point. We are, to be sure, concerned for your health too, but that is a very secondary consideration. For what shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his own soul? Matthew 16:26. That was Larry Taunton. Pastor Wilson responded that when he heard the news, he prayed for three things: that I would fight off the disease, and that I would make myself right with the eternity, and that the process would bring the two of us back into contact. He couldn't resist adding rather puckishly that the third prayer had already been answered. So there are some quite reputable Catholics, Jews, and Protestants who think that I might, in some sense of the word, be worth saving. The Muslim faction has been quieter. An Iranian friend has asked for a prayer to be said for me at the grave of Omar Khayyam, supreme poet of the Persian freethinkers. The YouTube video announcing the day of intercession for me is accompanied by the song I Think I Can See the Light, performed by the same Cat Stevens who, as Yusuf Islam, once endorsed the hysterical Iranian theocratic call to murder my friend Salman Rushdie. The banal lyrics of his pseudo uplifting song, by the way, appear to be addressed to a chick. And this apparent ecumenism has other contradictions too. If I were to announce that I had suddenly converted to Catholicism, I know that Larry Taunton and Douglas Wilson would feel I had fallen into grievous error. On the other hand, if I were to join either of the Protestant evangelical groups, the followers of Rome would not think my soul was much safer than it is now, while a late in life decision to adhere to Judaism or Islam would inevitably lose me many prayers from both factions. I sympathize afresh with the mighty Voltaire, who, when badgered on his deathbed and urged to renounce the devil, murmured that this was no time to be making enemies. The Danish physicist and Nobelist Niels Bohr once hung a horseshoe over his doorway. Appalled friends exclaimed that surely he didn't put any trust in such pathetic superstitions. No, I don't, he replied with composure, but apparently it works, whether you believe it or not. That might be the safest conclusion. The most comprehensive investigation of the subject ever conducted, the study of the therapeutic effects of intercessory prayer of 2006, could find no correlation at all between the number of regularity of prayers offered and the likelihood that the person being prayed for would have improved chances. But it did find a small, interesting negative correlation in that some patients suffered slight additional woe when they failed to manifest any improvement. They felt that they had disappointed their devoted supporters, and morale is another unquantifiable factor in survival. I now understand this better than I did when I first read it. An enormous number of secular and atheist friends have told me encouraging and flattering things like, if anyone can beat this, you can. Cancer has no chance against someone like you. We know you can vanquish this. On bad days and even on better ones, such exhortations can have a vaguely depressing effect. If I check out, I'll be letting all these comrades down. A different secular problem also occurs to me. What if I pulled through and the pious faction contentedly claimed that their prayers had been answered? That would somehow be irritating. I have saved the best of the faithful until the last. Dr. Francis Collins is one of the greatest living Americans. He is the man who brought the Human Genome Project to completion ahead of time and under budget, and who now directs the National Institutes of Health. In his work on the genetic origins of disorder, he helped decode the misprints that cause such calamities as cystic fibrosis and Huntington's disease. He is working now on the amazing healing properties that are latent in stem cells and in targeted gene-based treatments. This is great humanitarianism This great humanitarian is also a devotee of the work of C.S. Lewis, and in his book, The Language of God, has sent out the case for making science compatible with faith. This small volume contains an admirably terse chapter informing fundamentalists that the argument about evolution is over, mainly because there is no argument. I know Francis, too, from various public and private debates over religion. He had been kind enough to visit me in his own time and to discuss all sorts of novel treatments, only recently even imaginable, that might apply to my case. And let me put it this way. He hasn't suggested prayer. And I in turn haven't teased him about the screw tape letters. So those who want me to die in agony are really praying that the efforts of our most selfless Christian physicians be thwarted. Who is Dr. Collins to interfere with the divine design? By a similar twist, those who want me to burn in hell are also mocking those kind religious folk who do not find me unsalvageably evil. I leave these paradoxes to those friends and enemies who still venerate the supernatural. Pursuing the prayer, Pursuing the prayer thread through the labyrinth of the web, I eventually found a bizarre place bets video. This invites potential punters to put money on whether I will repudiate my atheism and embrace religion by a certain date or continue to affirm unbelief and take the hellish consequences. This isn't perhaps as cheap or as nasty as it may sound. One of Christianity's most cerebral defenders, Blaise Pascal, reduced the essentials to a wager as far back as the 17th century. Put your faith in the Almighty, he proposed, and you stand to gain everything. Decline the heavenly offer, and you lose everything if the coin falls the other way. Some philosophers also call this Pascal's gambit. Ingenious though the full reasoning of his essay may be, he was one of the founders of probability theory. Pascal assumes both a cynical God and an abjectly opportunist human being. Suppose I ditch the principles I have held for a lifetime in hope of gaining favor at the last minute? I hope and trust that no serious person would be at all impressed by such a hucksterish choice. Meanwhile, the God who would reward cowardice and dishonesty and punish irreconcilable doubt is among the many gods in which whom I do not believe. I don't mean to be churlish about any kind of intentions, but when September 20 comes, please do not trouble death, heaven, with your bootless cries, unless, of course, it makes you feel better. Many readers are familiar with the spirit and the letter of the definitions of prayer as given by Ambrose Bierce in his Devil's Dictionary. It runs like this and is extremely easy to comprehend. Prayer, a petition that the laws of nature be suspended in favor of the petitioner, himself confessedly unworthy. Everybody can see the joke that is lodged within this entry. The man who prays is the one who thinks that God has arranged matters all wrong, but who also thinks that he can instruct God how to put them right. Half buried in the contradiction is the distressing idea that nobody is in charge or nobody with any moral authority. The call to prayer is self-canceling. Those of us who don't take part in it will justify our abstention on the grounds that we do not need or care to undergo the futile process of continuous reinforcement. Either our convictions are enough in themselves or they are not. At any rate, they do require standing in a crowd and uttering constant and uniform incantations. This is ordered by one religion to take place 5 times a day and by other monotheists for almost that number, while all of them set aside at least one whole day for the exclusive praise of the Lord. And Judaism seems to consist in its original constitution of a huge list of prohibitions that must be followed before all else. The tone of the prayers replicates the silliness of the mandate, in that God is enjoined or thanked to do what he was going to do anyway. Thus, the Jewish male begins each day by thanking God for not making him into a woman or a Gentile, while the Jewish woman contents herself with thanking the Almighty for creating her as she is. Presumably, the Almighty is pleased to receive this tribute to his power and the approval of those he created. It's just that, if he is truly Almighty, the achievement would seem rather a slight one. Much the same applies to the idea that prayer, instead of making Christianity look foolish, makes it appear convincing. We'll just stay with the Christianity today. Now, it can be asserted with some confidence, first, that its deity is all wise and all powerful, and second, that its congregants stand in desperate need of that deity's infinite wisdom and power. Just to give some elementary quotations, it is stated in the book The Philippians 4:6, "Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication and thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God." Deuteronomy 34:32, chapter 4, proclaims that he is the rock. His work is perfect. And Isaiah 64:8 tells us, "Now, O Lord, thou art our Father. We art clay, and thou our potter, and we are all the work of thy hand." Note, then, that Christianity insists on the absolute dependence of its flock, and then only on the offering of undiluted praise and thanks. A person using prayer time to ask for the world to be set to rights or to beseech God to bestow a favor upon himself would in effect be guilty of a profound blasphemy, or at the very least, a pathetic misunderstanding. It is not for the mere human to be presuming that he or she can advise the divine. And this, sad to say, opens religion to the additional charge of corruption. The leaders of the church know perfectly well that prayer is not intended to gratify the devout, so that every time they accept a donation in return for some petition, they are accepting a gross negation of their faith, a faith that depends on the passive acceptance of the devout and not on their making demands for betterment. Eventually, and after a bitter and schismatic quarrel, practices like the notorious sale of indulgences were abandoned. But many a fine basilica or chantry would not be standing today if this awful violation had not turned such a spectacularly good profit. And today, it is easy enough to see at the revival meetings of Protestant fundamentalists the counting of the checks and bills before the laying on of hands by the preacher has even been completed. Again, the spectacle is a shameless one, with the Calvinists having in some way replaced Rome as the most exorbitant holy fundraisers. And before we run out of contradictions, it seems doubly absurd that for a Calvinist to take an interest in divine intercession. The founding constitution of Presbyterian Church famously proclaimed that from Philadelphia that, quote, by the decree of God, for the manifestation of his glory, some men and angels are predestinated unto everlasting life, and others foreordained for everlasting death, without any foresight of faith or good works, or perseverance in either of them, or any other thing in the creature as conditions. Plainly put, this means that it does not matter whether you try to lead a holy life or even succeed in doing so. Random caprice will still determine whether or not you receive a heavenly reward. In these circumstances, the emptiness of prayer is almost the least of it. Beyond that minor futility, the religion which treats its flock as a credulous plaything offers one of the cruelest spectacles that can be imagined. A human being in fear and doubt who is openly exploited to believe in the impossible. In the argument over prayer, then, please do not be shocked if it is we atheists who wear the pitying look as any moment of moral crisis threatens to draw near. End of chapter 2.